Could you guys all, when I say ngaji gurujin, can you guys please say gala? Oh, we're going to go again. Gala. Woo, that's good. I love it. Awesome. So remember that. Gala. Awesome. And on my right, all my family on the right, can I get you all to stand up, please? Thank you. And when I say ngaji gurujin and point to you, can you guys all say mabu? We're going to lift the roof, say mabu. Wow, brilliant. All right. So everyone ready? All my family on the left? You guys ready? Family on the right? You ready? Okay. Ngaji gurujin. Ngaji gurujin. Ngaji gurujin. Ngaji gurujin. Brilliant. Give yourself a round of applause. That was awesome. So all we did was Jaya Yagya Rewi, talking on country. And I said, Ngaji gurujin, a Yaru term for how are you all? And if you are feeling good, which I hope you are, you guys together said Gala Mabu, which is we are good. And I hope you're feeling good. But I know who's feeling good after a long plane ride from a very long way away. As these bunch of deadly Aboriginal First Nations peoples. And I'd like to now introduce Leilani Darwin, a Quandamuka woman currently living in Ipswich, Dr. Virgil Moorhead Jr., who's a member of the Big Lagoon Rancheria, as well as part of the First Nation Yurok and Tolowa peoples, and also Lacey Clare. Elsie Puktuk, Nikoma, Migoma, First Nations people, New Brunswick, Canada. Woo, can we give them a round of applause, please? Thank you.
We got Canadians.
So I'd like to start in this conversation by asking Leilani, can you please give us an understanding of what you're currently doing in the youth mental health space?
Sure. Thank you very much, Scott. I'm actually going to start a little bit by telling you about who I am. I like to do this as it gives context, and as an Indigenous person, I think it's relatable to how sometimes it's not about the titles and what we do, but it's about who we are as people and our connections to culture and land. So it's been probably just under a year since I actually found out I was Quandamuka, which is quite exciting for me. And that has had its challenges over the years, particularly as a young person. I have lived experience. I am bereaved by, particularly most significantly, my mother when I was 10 by suicide, and she had a long history of mental illness and self-harming. And others, my sister, best friend, and it's not uncommon for us, unfortunately. I'm also a survivor of suicide 3 times, and they ranged in age span from 13 till 21. So most of my access and journey in mental illness and in the suicide area have been as a young person, and particularly some of the work I've done is relevant to that. I'm very privileged to be here as First Nations person of Australia, and just wanted to put for context that I don't represent everyone, that it is in fact my own perspectives that I'm sharing, and that can be very different depending on who you're talking to and where they're from. And I think that's part of our uniqueness and what we're doing. But at the moment in particular, I've just joined the Black Dog Institute as the head of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Lived Experience Centre, which is brand new funding from Minister Ken Wyatt, to really start to explore what does lived experience mean for First Nations people in Australia, and how can we support people to have a voice at the table. That's a bit about me.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Leilani. Dr. Virgil, do you?
Yeah, so currently, I'm part of the Big Lagoon Rancheria, and I work for our nonprofit, our sort of mental health part of our tribe. And that's in Northern California. It's about 5 hours north of San Francisco. And I'm the behavioral health director, so I'm a licensed psychologist. And really, we're doing a lot of youth programming and working in the schools. Where I'm from, the largest tribe in the state of California, the Yurok tribe, is there. And where I'm working specifically, the majority of my time is on the Hoopa Valley Reservation, which is the largest tribe per land base in the state of California. So I'm working with a lot of young Native, primarily men, and in just doing counseling and different mental health related activities and things around prevention, and really, working with my family too. I grew up on the reservation the first 18 years of my life, and then went to college and all the way to get my doctorate. And so I came back to my community about 4 years ago. So I'm really just working in my community and working in the surrounding tribal communities where I'm at for around mental health.
Brilliant. Thanks, Virgil.
My turn. I currently am working in my home community of Elsipogtog. I'm the Access Open Minds research assistant, but I started out with that project as a member of the Youth Council and the Indigenous Council, and I was on another one at one point. I'm now the research assistant, but I was also a peer. I guess the work we're doing is something innovative for Indigenous communities, as Access did not come into the community and say, here is your solution, we're going to save you, as many other policies, programs tend to do in a First Nations. They came in and said, what do you need from us so that you can help your youth? And so majority of our team is from Elsipogtog or from the sites that they're at. And we're basically a mental health outreach. That's what it is. It's not the typical office setting. If a youth is having a bad day and they reach out to us on Facebook, that's where we'll talk to them. If they say, hey, I want to go for a walk, that's where we'll be with them. They want a coffee, we'll take them for a drive to the local Tim Hortons, which is Canadian coffee. But that's basically what I do. Like I said, I'm more into the research field now, but that is more to ensure that all the research being collected and then later interpreted is going to be done through the cultural lens. That's something I'm very passionate about now. Too many times studies have been done on our people instead of by our people for our people. That's something I'm really passionate about now, is making sure that anything, I guess you could say any study, any research conducted is for us, so that we can now develop best practices from the results of that. And also the results are going to be seen through a cultural lens, because research tools weren't developed for us. So it's a lot of interpretation. About myself, I grew up off reserve, actually, for 12 years of my life. I summered on reserve with my family, and then I would go to school. That was like a difficult time, I guess you could say. I knew I was different from my classmates, but I also didn't feel that real connection to home either, because I felt like that's not where I lived. And it was really hard with the language. My mother was teaching me the language, and my uncle would not speak English to me. So when I would go back to school, to the non-native school in September, I would always mix up my words. And I remember distinctively coming home from school and telling my mom, I'm not speaking Mi'kmaq anymore. And she said, why? And I was like, because I'm always getting in trouble, because I'll mix up my words and they'll make me write lines. So I told her I'm not speaking it anymore. And that's something, as I got older, I realized, like, it wasn't so much that I lost my language, but I felt that I had to discard it in order to succeed in school. And that's something a lot of our youth deal with, having to leave the reserve to go to school. They have to straddle those two worlds, their cultural world, and then if they want a decent education, they need to go off reserve, and then they also have to fit into that world. And it's something I'm pretty passionate about, so it's just a little bit about me, I guess.
Yeah.
And you got to cut me off because I'll just keep talking.
Thank you all for sharing that. I think you've all touched on an idea of mental health, and kind of what we'd like to share with everyone is kind of how Aboriginal people across the globe are challenged by unique experiences in communities. And there's not one community exactly like the other. And in saying that, I would love to hear your opinion, your perspective through your lived experience, and give clarity in terms of what mental health is for Aboriginal and First Nations peoples. And so I would love to hear your perspective on that.
I think it's interesting because we throw the terminology mental health around, and particularly here in Australia, we interchange that with social and emotional well-being. And the reality of it is it's not known as mental illness or mental health in our communities. It is more about social and emotional well-being, which is that concept of culture, of our connections to our culture, to our country, to our kin, social determinants of health, and the historical kind of policies and practices that have occurred that continue to have impacts on us now. It's much more easily relatable for us to understand that, and often even the physicality of how we would describe being mentally unwell. You don't talk about what's going on in your head. You might talk about feeling or feel sick in the guts and different kind of terminologies in that. So I think that's relevant. When I was a young person, though, to be honest, it was still not really spoken about that much. And I must say, I think this is quite useful for people to understand a little bit better, is that I was what I call a system kid. So at times when I became unwell, and you know, after my first attempt, and I was in hospital, and then I had counselling afterwards, and I remember my auntie who I was living with after my mum died, and she was like, "Oh, I'm paying all this money and you're not even doing anything, you're not getting out of it." And I'm thinking, I used to be in and out of foster cares and child safety to be involved. Do you think I'm going to tell them anything? But as a young person, I wasn't also going to share that with my auntie, because she didn't need to know that I knew how to play the game. You only share so much. You don't give too much information, because then you might not be with your loved one or your care providers. And so I myself, even as a young person, didn't really relate that to being mentally unwell. And that kind of came, you know, into my early 20s, where things just hit a precipice. But it's definitely, mental illness is not necessarily the terminology of which that's reflected for a lot of the youth here.
Thank you, Leilani.
Yeah, so mental health, you know, I think we have to first, as Indigenous people, and for all of you here, you know, listening to us, that you know, the idea of culture, our Indigenous, what it means to be Indigenous is not static. That we're just as much modern, just as much multicultural, hybrid in our ways of being. And so the mental health, what is mental health? For Indigenous people of the community that I come from, it's hybrid. And so I'll give you an example of maybe what it means in California, Northern California. There's a program, the state of California put out, the Department of Public Health, that they identified 6 sort of at-risk groups, one being Native Americans, one being, you know, African American, and there were 6, you know, and so the idea behind this project is how to do business differently in mental health in Indigenous communities. And so my tribe, our nonprofit, got one of the programs to do it, right? And so I put together an advisory board, me and the co-project lead, and we got together 12 of the most culturally sort of informed, traditional, ceremonial people of our community, and we posed that question. What is mental health for Native communities in Northern California, in Northwest California, in the land of Yurok and Hoopa and Tolowa? And so we went around for about a year to answer that question. And you know, one of the things that came up is that this idea of mental health is really new. for too many of our elders. And so, they say the traditional mental health sort of diagnostic categories, no. They say, talk therapy, no, we don't do that. But also they say, we don't know what the answers are to this suicide, to our youth struggling. And so they look to us, the people that went to college, these well-respected traditional ceremonial people said, we don't know. We don't know what mental health is, because the old ways, the ceremonial ways is helping in part, but it's not helping completely. So one of the things we got out of that was like these new sort of educated Native American people, you have the answers to what mental health is. And so I think it's in process, just like Indigenous peoples' cultural and their identities are in process. And so I think in our community, we're still figuring it out. One of the big pieces is spirituality, relationships, language, land-based sort of pedagogies, but we're still figuring it out.
Thank you.
I just like everything they said. But I'm also noticing, like, what Leilani was saying, like, that's something so similar, all the way across the country in my community. You didn't speak about mental health, because if you did, it's still stigmatized today that if you were a youth and you said, I'm having a hard time, or I'm depressed, or I am sad, you ran the risk of child services knocking at your door. And the youth knew that, and that was something terrifying to them. Like, I can't ask for help. I can't tell anybody that I'm mentally unwell, because I'll get taken away from my parents. And that's a reality still to this day, which is awful. But, so yeah, mental health, mental wellness, being depressed, sad, that's something very new that's being spoken about. Again, like what Virgil was saying, our elders, our traditionalists, the problems our youth are facing now with mental health isn't something that we had then. Like, obviously there still probably would have been some mental health problems, but it wasn't something they seen, and it wasn't this problem that it is now. And how do I word this nicely? Again, something like Virgil was saying, we're more modern now. Yeah. And I just want to state that, yes, we are modern, we adapted, we are not assimilated, we are not colonized. Why? Because we still identify as who we are. So just because we adapted to a modern world does not make us any less Native, or just to put that out there first. But because we are more modern now, we are finding more modern problems in our communities and with our youth. So it is up to the ones who have gone to university and studied psych to come back to the communities and then look through a more two-eyed seeing lens of, all right, this is the mainstream, this is what I went to school and I learned. Now, how do I take my culture and also adapt that into helping our youth? So it's true, like what Virgil was saying, we can't really define mental health in our communities right now because it's something emerging, I guess, and changing.
Yeah, no, definitely. Okay. Taking in all of what you've said, it's just so crazy that, our culture is so similar in the way of how we think about life in terms of that holistic pedagogy, that everything's so interconnected, and there's not only social determinants, historical determinants, political determinants of how we feel in terms of our social and emotional well-being, but it goes beyond that. And I feel growing up as youth back home as well, I share the same view in terms of I did not know, mostly in terms of that intergenerational trauma, because my dad grew up not really being able to express how he felt. And there was always that suppressed idea that we could not share that or we'd be known less than a man. And that has intergenerationally impacted on me and how late I've come out in terms of talking about and expressing how I feel and what I've gone through and sharing my story. And you can see how many people, there's this similar concepts and understanding of what is currently impacting youth back then, and now hopefully understanding youth today. And that brings us to the next question, and I really want to dig deeper into understanding your lived experience, because for us here, Aboriginal people in Australia, the whole idea of dreaming, as we spoke about before in private, is that everything coexists with us in this point in time. We can't go anywhere without understanding our past to influence what we do presently, to understand where we're going in future. Everything is so holistic and constant and flowing in the sense of hybrid, this culture of understanding that everything's flowing. Right now it exists in what we do today. And so reflecting on our past, I would like to actually understand in terms of Leilani, Virgil, Lacey, kind of your experience growing up in community and kind of the supports around what you face in understanding your cultural identity, suicide, and all these feelings, and how do you feel it has evolved or changed, or if there has been any changes to what currently our young people in community are needing today?
Yeah, how long have we got? I reckon I could write a whole
Briefly,
chapter in a book on this now. Just for context, I wanted to share too that, so my connection to being an Aboriginal woman is on my mum's side of the family. I'm actually an immigrant. On my dad's side of the family, they moved over from Burma, and they are of French Indian background. And my grandfather fought in the World War. Like, I have quite a complex cultural background, but to the point of me saying to everyone that I'd only just really recently identified where my mob, where my people are from, goes to the fact that my surname's not actually Darwin. And when my grandmother was alive, she refused to say where we were from and where what our actual surname was, because of the fact that it wasn't a good thing to be an Aboriginal person in this country. And in fact, back in those days, if you were subject to some really harsh and restrictive practices and massacres of our people. So that for me as a young person was interesting, because in my family, who I grew up with on my mum's side of the family, they're all fair skin. And my grandmother and I were the only ones with dark skin. And I'll tell you what that meant for me. I didn't see myself as a person of colour until I experienced racism as a young person. And that was often in the school environment or in the community environment in different places, where someone would call me a black this or an abo that, and I'd be like, hey, what? And I my sister, and she's like, my sister was real good. She's like, no, who was that? I'll go get him, And I'm like, what? And I'm like, and then sometimes I'd be like, oh, that's right, I'm dark. I'm different. And I wanted to start off with sharing that, because for me as a young person, I see that even more so now with our young people and the challenges. And, fellow panel members have mentioned it already. And for us, and we've heard it here a lot in Australia, is that concept of working and walking in two worlds. So it's our cultural and family responsibilities versus how do we live in a modern day society with westernised mainstream practices and values that actually intrinsically don't link in to our collectionist cultures, which are more about us collectively and not individuals. I see young people these days who don't want to be recognised or acknowledged as an Indigenous person, because the media and other things that happen, they are ostracised, they are judged. I have it myself still to this day. I can walk in somewhere and I know the undercover people are following me around in the store, making sure I'm buying things. I don't get served in jewellery stores. I can tell you some stories. And for what becomes part of our everyday life, you don't realise the impacts that has on our soul and our well-being. It might become normalised to us, but that impacts us in the longer term. We become very resilient because of our experiences that we have. And I will be very honest in saying that with a lot of our First Nations people in this country and our young people, we grow up quick. part of that is actually our cultural learning styles, which is one of the most intelligent in the world. If you haven't had a chance to kind of research it, you really should, because we're very, very strong. You know, you see at a young age, you then practice and you do. So our learning styles are very strong. But we'd also have been in this really terrible cycle of poverty and dispossession and trauma that has been broken at different times in different family groups, and it certainly has been in mine. It's really interesting to consider yourself and reflect on, if someone has only ever grown up in a certain environment where they're moving all the time, where all the people in that community don't work, where they do drugs, where they drink, where they gamble, where they fight, where terrible, terrible things happen, and you expect them to change that without ever showing them or letting them know, but there's opportunities for that. That is the strength that I have seen in sharing lived experiences, to let our young people know that I was in your place too once. And none of it was easy, but guess what? I'm still standing here. Those reflections now from when I was a young kid, losing people in my communities, seeing violence, you know, in and out of foster care, mum spending time in jail, there was key points for me to get to where I am now. So that relatability for young people, when I have worked with them on the front line and done risk assessments from a clinical space and kept them safe, it was that point of being able to show I was just like you that allowed them an opportunity to feel safe and open up. And I think that for young people to have the opportunity to see that more in the services and like the outreach models, and not thinking it has to fit in a westernized way of doing things, that is where we're seeing the most success in this country.
Thank you. I could go on to.
So, you know, my father once told me that his father, my grandfather, who's, you know, a full Talawa man, that when my father was growing up, his father, my grandfather, would tell him, you know, why are you hanging out with those Indians? Which was, you know, he was trying to get my father to like stay on the right track, or to go to college, which my father did some college. He was the first to do some college in our tribe. But so I've tried to really, you know, understand, you know, where my grandfather was coming from, in the sense of saying, like, why are you hanging out with the Indians, which is his own people, right? And, you know, I think his generation, you know, he struggled. He lost, you know, 2 of his 3 kids to alcohol and drugs. My father's the only one living now. He was just trying to survive, right? He was, you know, I think that the racism and the oppression was much more sort of overt, or just much more direct and blatant, his generation, my read on it. And I think, you know, our story, from my grandfather to my father to me, you know, my father also struggled with alcohol. You know, he got sober when I was 11. You know, he's been sober for like 27 years now. And then, you know, I struggled with alcohol and drugs, and I'm sober for 11 years. And so that, from my grandfathers to just surviving, right? Because, you know, the European, when they came to California, where I'm from, it was the last stop. So when there was massacres, there was the genocidal practices, Humboldt County, Northern California was one of the last to be really impacted. So these traumas, as some would call it, are pretty fresh with my grandfather. And so I think now, my generation, my son and daughter's generation, I think, you know, there's a tremendous amount of pride in being indigenous and being native, that ceremonies are being brought back that were shut down, such as the flower dance, which is the women's coming of age ceremony. They shut it down, and just about 30 years ago they started back, and now there's more and more young girls participating in the flower dance. Just last week in Humboldt County, Northern California, the city of Eureka gave back a piece of land where it was one of the worst massacres in the history of the United States, the Indian Island Massacre, and they just gave it back to the Wiyot people. But the gym was full, front page of the newspaper, and just a pride of Native people in our area. I think that's the difference. But from my grandfather's generation of why are you hanging out with the Indians, I don't think there's as much as that. I think there's much more pride in really trying to be leaders and being proactive, not just within Native communities, but in the United States in general, right? In leading in our practices of mental health, or what we would call mental health, like we can be leaders. And I think there is this pride of some would call it decolonizing, but I think that's the difference that I see.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks, Virgil.
I have to start going first. These guys they blowing me away, and then I can't think. I guess for my lived experience, I'd have to go back first to my mother, or my grandmother, actually. My grandmother, struggled with alcoholism, so she lost her children. So my aunts, uncles, my mother all grew up in foster care. My mother was unfortunate enough to be placed with a residential school survivor. She was placed with First Nations, but somebody who had gone through the residential school, which it made you hate yourself. That was the goal of the residential schools, was basically their motto, was kill the Indian, save the child. So she was then being raised by somebody who hated themselves, who hated her, and they took that out on her. So it was a very abusive home, both physical and sexual. She turned to drugs and alcohol as well, and it wasn't until I was 7 that I was taken from her and put into the system. And thankfully, she was able to get herself clean. She's been sober since I was 7 years old, 33 now. You can do the math, but so like I said, thankfully, she was able to get herself sober. She was able to get herself, back on her feet and then get me back. Many years later, when I was a teenager and going through my own personal demons, I started drinking, I think, at 12, getting into trouble, just, total wrong path, getting kicked out of school, not even going to school. She decided, I give up. I don't know what to tell this girl anymore. I don't know what to do with her. She sat me down and decided to tell me her story. This is what I went through. And I came out, she's like, I'm teaching now, so you can too. And that's something, at 16, I was still, whatever, I'm gonna go get drunk, Mom, I don't care. Typical teenager in a sense. I was angry, multiple suicide attempts myself, lost too many friends to count by the time I was 18. But I think my mother's struggle and knowing she overcame it is what allowed me to know I could. So I sobered up at 21, 12 years sober now. And in that time when I was struggling though, my mother did reach out to mental health workers, psychologists in the area, like, somebody help my daughter, I don't know how to help her. At one point, I remember sitting across from the school psychologist, and her solution to me was, you're never going to get better because you live in a reserve. You're never going to overcome this stuff because you live in the reserve and because your mother failed you as a child. She literally said that to me. I remember being so angry. And I looked across at this woman and I told her, when I get older, I'm going to become a psychologist and I'm going to take your job. She's actually the one who hired me to work in El Subocto afterwards. So that was my goal, and that's, I guess, my lived experience that caused me to go into that field. But it's been a struggle. It's still a struggle for anybody in our communities, but
Thank you for sharing those stories, and I think we can start to actually really embody the theme, and what we're trying to do is start that transfer of knowledge. And I forgot to mention at the beginning is that currently, or with my perspective, is that we, not only as Aboriginal people, First Nations peoples, but a lot of youth organizations are currently stuck in their silos, and it's about time to actually break down those walls and actually start transferring that knowledge and working together. And with what you've all just told us, and shared with us was so beautiful, and I really want to take this opportunity to actually ask you and transfer that knowledge in a way of what is currently working, because we've established an understanding of what our lived experience was in terms of defining and understanding our own social, emotional well-being, and understanding the needs now of our current youth that are struggling and going through what we may have experienced, or if not more. What are you all currently doing now in way of reducing stigma in all of your roles and projects? How have you found in terms of impacting stigma on young First Nations peoples? And could you please share how you found this, or what approach you've taken to deliver on these outcomes, which I'd love to hear.
I'd like to start off with saying, particularly relevant, and I'll be interested to get your guys' perspective too. In Australia, Western kind of definition, youth, 12, 25, younger, under 25. However, even if you were to go back to Broomway, actually just recently that community said, well, no, our youth go up to 38. And I think that's really important to remember, that when you're working in different communities, your definition of what is youth might not be what that community recognises as youth. So you have to take that into consideration with the work that you're doing and ask the question. I've seen some really amazing things happening, and always there's a few key things behind that. And themes, self-determination is one. At times where there is self-determination in the responses and the reactions and the projects and the programs and the policies of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, including their leadership at all stages, not just when it suits, which was being referred to earlier as we were talking about sometimes the tokenistic approach. That is where we see real change. I think it's really important to move away from the best of intentions of thinking, there's a problem, I've got a solution, let's go do it. What we're seeing now more, particularly in Australia, and I'm not sure how many people are actually aware of this, services going into a community after having received funding to do it. That community telling them to walk themselves back out because they never consulted with them first or asked them if they wanted them there, and in fact that community didn't. I think that's about self-determination, and I think that's about us finally having a say as to what's going to work for us. Where we see that key point of difference with our young people is not being afraid to engage them. That work is happening at a local level from our elders in communities, because I will be upfront and honest in saying there are still elders in our communities who think talking about suicide and mental ill health and other factors makes it happen and can actually increase risk. In that case, that's just a level of respect that's where they come from. You work with the people who actually want your help. Where we're able to understand that we don't need to mollycoddle our young people, and that in fact they can inform us in a way in which we aren't really in tune with, and that we probably aren't on the ground enough to really understand what it's like for them living and working and getting along, and with all the stuff in digital mental health and the impacts. I mean, my 13-year-old daughter educates me all the time. I say old things to her which I think are just colloquial Australian sayings. She's like, what? Never heard of that. But I mean, you know, that's the kind of the fun part about engaging with young people as well, bringing them to the table if you have an idea in the first instance. Don't bring them at a stage that suits you. And don't just bring them once. throughout it, you were talking about research and evaluation, and it's something I've really kind of gotten to understand that we continue to fail as a country here. The Lowacha Institute has best practices available on research and evaluation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And I will bet you right now and across this whole room that every single organisation that is here does not adhere to that best practice. That talks about all stages of negotiation, of working with local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to even identify if the reciprocity, and so that means what you're gaining from researching that community, if that is there for the community to have something back for them. So the concepts of reciprocity, of involvement and of governance, of the leadership of that. Have you got the right people at the table? If this is for youth, why don't we have young people here having a say and determining what that is? When I've developed social-emotional wellbeings for young people that have been delivered in communities, I brought them to the table and said, hey, here's what I want to do, and can I run through some activities with you, and what do you think? Is it stupid? Is it good? And they'll tell you the truth if you want to hear it. But being able to actually utilise their voices and understand the strength that comes from that is important. And I think just in my last point for this too is our youth are our future. And there is a whole lot of impacts and issues and stresses that they have now that those of us who are older didn't experience and weren't impacted by. So as many ways as we can give them an opportunity to show that there is a bright future for them and that they are self-determined and eloquent and able to inform what that looks like, the better it is to make sure that they are linked in and know that they've got options, and that whilst there will always be stigma around mental ill health and accessing, and particularly in our communities, and when it takes 2 seconds, what you doing over there, you wombi, you weird, crazy one, something wrong up there. We judge, our young people judge. People get very creative, particularly in rural and remote spaces, and they, will go somewhere else or they'll access a different service. But we can work with that if we show them there's hope for the future. That we need to improve on.
Thank you. Thank you, Leonardo. Virgil?
So the question is, what is working currently, right?
Yes, what is working in regards to reducing stigma and a lot of the awesome, deadly work you're currently doing?
Yeah, I think, she's a psychologist. She was Stanford trained. Her name's Stephanie Freiberg, and she's at, I think, the University of Washington now in the States. And she did some research in the, I think, early 2000s. And one of the things that came out of it was this idea of possible selves. And so she looked at a large sort of national sample, very rigorous study of like, what do Native American youth, young people, what do they think they can become? So it's kind of speaking of the hope and what is portrayed in the media. And so what she found was there was like 3 possible selves that were portrayed in the media in the United States. And one was like the drunken, drug, inflicted Native person that was stuck in poverty. Another was like the romantic sort of Pocahontas. Mm-hmm. And another was like the sort of barbaric kind of like warrior. And that's what was portrayed in the media about Native people. And so her argument was those were the possible selves. They didn't see that they can become a lawyer or they can become a psychologist. And that really impacted their self-esteem and impacted their development, right? And so how is that related to your question and the work that I've been doing? I think that what we've been doing in our community is really trying to enlarge and give more possible selves to the youth. And how do we do that? By example. So me going back into the community and really finding other people in the community to be part of our team. Because then they see, oh, look, there's Virgil. Like, he's sober. He's working hard. He's positive. Like, he's talking about emotions and feelings, And then you go and have another young Native man or somebody that's working with me, and the youth, they start seeing that. Well, there's the possible selves. And I think that the important point that I'm sort of finding is that more than the theory, more than the intervention, more than anything, it's the person. Because what we need is consistency, is love, of care, of compassion, of empathy, and that this is more than a job. Because the youth that we're working with, the amount of sort of developmental complex trauma oppression, like this has to happen over generations in a sustained period of time. So finding the right people, right, that care, and then in doing that, you're showing that there's more possible selves, more different positive things that you can become. Yeah. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, no. Thank you, Virgil. And I just wanted to add to that, back in community, I feel like it's more so this step away from just awareness. I feel like it's always been all about mental health awareness and not actually immersing yourself in the community. Like growing up, I literally, if you would ask me name a youth mental health organization in your community, I wouldn't know what to say. And now it's just taking that step through, it's more than just a job. And taking it on in terms of building that network, not as in terms of that professional relationship, but as building a family. And I feel by going past that, I feel if that happened back in the day, I would have had a much better relationship in terms of understanding my youth mental health at that point, or even understanding what organizations are there for me. And I feel like today, young people are still trapped in that we're there when you need us, instead of we are going to be by your side throughout your journey. And I think that shift and then changing that shift into being more inclusivity and that inclusive nature, and actually shifting that, I understand it. So thank you for saying that. And Alexi.
I'd just like to start something Virgil was saying, like it's generational, right? Yeah. It took, 520 some years to create all of these traumas that our youth now live with. So our goals, I guess you could say, we're not going to heal our communities like that. That's just not going to happen. What it is make this generation stronger, healthier, smarter, better, so that they can come back to the community after, again, make their children stronger, healthier. And it continues on till we have an entire strong, healthy nation again, the way we did, pre-colonization. So what I find working now is on just the individual, and also not, like I said before, programs always came in, we're going to save you. This works. We have research that tells you this works, yet we did none of this research on your people, so we have no actual proof that it works for you, but it works, So then our communities would spend as much money as they possibly had to get this brilliant program in that's going to work. And it really wasn't until we stopped. And like Leilani was saying, our communities are all now saying no. Like, we don't need you to save us. We can save ourselves because we know what's wrong. You know what I mean? And we're gonna do it. You wanna support us? Okay, give us some help. But don't come in and say this is what's gonna work. So now our approach to mental health in my community, and the way we're all doing it, is we just simply ask the youth, what do you need? What do you want from us? Do you want counseling? Yes, okay. Where would you like to go? Do you want me to go with you as well? And it's that self-determination as well. Like, they're in charge of it, and we let them know you're in charge of your own care. You're in charge of how you're going to heal. Do you want to go to a sweat lodge ceremony? Okay, fine, let's go. Get in the car, we'll go to the sweat. And we're very right there with them the whole way through. A lot of these youth, their main problem is that they don't feel they have someone sometimes that they can count on, because they're either growing up in the system, being bounced around. They don't have that one solid person that they always know they have. The way we're approaching it is we're allowing them to know, like, I'm your person. Yeah. If you need something, I'm there for you. Whether it be as simple as filling out a job application, or as crazy as university applications and scholarships, we're there to help them get through it. And it's working. It really, truly is. And I'm so excited for when the research comes out from the Access Project, because it's going to show it. And I love the fact that we follow the OCAP principles, whereas that information belongs to our community. And, you know, like I was saying before, we get to use that. Finally, we can use it to show everyone this is working, and our youth are getting better, they are getting stronger, and it's identity as well. There was a movement a few years back in Canada called the Idle No More movement. It was kind of big, you know, protests and everything. Some people look at it like, oh, it was a cool movement and it was over, but what it did was it gave our youth that pride. You know, no longer was it uncool to be Native, you know. Our own youth would tease other youth if they went to ceremony. They'd be like, ah, you're Tahoe. Like that was the derogatory word they would use, like, ah, you're Tahoe, you're not cool, you go to powwows. Like, they're just, you know, 5 years ago, that was the mentality still. And then through this Idle No More, like the resurgence of pride in who you are, our youth are now having this pride, and they're even having pride in community, whereas before, if you ask somebody from my community, where are you from, we weren't gonna say where we're from. Automatically, it was racism and, oh, you're from there. Now they're like, I'm from El Subuktuk, you know, and they're proud to say it. And I'm proud to say it. I'm proud to say I'm Mi'kmaq, and now our youth are too. And for the ones of us who are, you know, who have gone to school, gotten sober, working, we're able to show them, like Virgil was saying, we are their new role models. Before they didn't have that. They didn't see past, you know, the bad. And now they can see good and they see help. And that hope, that identity and self-determination, that's working. And it's, like I said, I can't wait for our research to come out because it's gonna show, like it's working. It's really working.
Awesome. Oh, thank you. Thanks, Lacey. I think I would also, we've kind of been moving towards everything has been like kind of coming together in terms of leading to an understanding of how important culture is in terms of self-determination, determining how we preserve, share, include, and understand our own culture in what we do in our day-to-day life, in terms of the pride that we're seeing in young people today. And I would like to kind of dig deeper into that, because I've heard or read some stuff about you, Leilani. Mm-hmm. And I've heard you use this term of more culturally appropriate programs. And Virgil, I also wanted to add is that you've mentioned this, I love this quote, is culture is prevention. And also Lacey, in terms of your fasting and your understanding of your culture and how you bring that through your projects, I really want to fully understand how organizations, agencies, services can integrate culture in a practical sense, in way of being culturally appropriate, providing culture as a way of prevention, and actually that pride for culture to kindly intertwine with everything else that goes with youth mental health. So if you would like to share, that'd be great.
I probably choose to focus on the opportunity to have really strong Indigenous governance within your organisation as an area that you could see a lot of difference in, and not just service delivery, but engagement with local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Often in mainstream services, one of the biggest gaps is not having that identifiable person from the community that they trust and that they know, and so it stops people from engaging. If you were to actually explore and look at strong Indigenous governance from your local elders and identified leaders and emerging leaders with your youth, getting them to help inform and shape your practices within the organisation, the priorities for the local area, and how your service can work together. Because one of the things I've learned more and more as I work in this area is that it's not First Nations people on their own doing it all on their own. But in fact, we need our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters working with us collaboratively and in a space of equal power. And I say that respectfully because I've been in enough situations where I've seen that sometimes not through realisation, but just through not understanding cultural processes and how they work, but that organisations position themselves where they are the people of power and authority, and those local community members and elders aren't. So you're already kind of setting up barriers to have failure and for things not to be successful. But if you're able to come to the table on an equal playing field and go, you guys are the leaders, you know your culture. I always reflect this in talking to a few people about it, and I have so much respect for academics, and you know, I've been able to get into the research and evaluation space and published a few times, and you know, always doing things, but I'm like, man, I don't know how you manage to get through all your studies and get your degree. Like, that's some hard work right there. And on the flip side of that, guess what? You can't pay to have my culture. You can't pay to learn what I know in my soul and my heart and my every being. And I reflect that as someone is, to be completely honest with you, I don't even know how I ended up working in this area, having like 12 years working in government, and certain doors opened up and I was like, what the heck's going on? I never knew that the full journey that I would come around now, and how I just know that my ancestors and my spirits have guided me to be here now. And my biggest thing in that is have the right people at the table. Be respectful. And that includes paying. Sorry, it's just a pain point for me. Yes, you have to pay for that cultural expertise, just so you know, because it's respectful. And people, particularly our elders and others, work very hard to know and be really knowledgeable in those areas. And they are the ones that you have to talk to be able to find out if what you're doing is appropriate. You can be creative in what that payment looks like, but I would always give the options to the people that you're asking to have that voice. But yeah, just as probably one thing, I'd say invest in local Indigenous governance within your organisation, and embed it in a level where it can actually have impact and make change. Don't bring them in as a working group or a potential steering committee. No, you need to have it at the right level, that they are equal players in the direction of what happens in their local community.
Thank you, Leilani. I'm just aware of time. However, I would love to, if you were able to reduce all of your great knowledge, that I'd love to spend all night here and share with you. But if you were to break it down to 3 major things in your perspective in regards to how organizations can actually integrate culture into the service providing system or their approach to engaging our youth.
Can 2 work?
2 work, yes.
So it's rugby, right? In this.
Yeah, rugby.
Right, rugby. So in the United States, there's the American football, right? And so, you know, if you've ever watched American football, or if you went to a concert and the singer jumps off the stage into the crowd, right? And in American football, sometimes when you score a touchdown, you jump into the crowd. And so what I'm saying with that metaphor or analogy is going into the community, jumping into the crowd, and listening, and getting outside of your comfort zone, right? And understanding what that particular community that you would be working with is really about, you know, in a non-judgmental way. So I think that's one. I did. The second is I wrote an article with this professor from, he's at Harvard now, his name's Joe Gahn, and we really looked at like what culture is for Native people in North America. And so he brought together traditional healers, Indigenous researchers, and Indigenous providers, and I did the sort of transcript of the research to look at the themes. And the major theme of what is traditional healing, how is culture important to us, kind of mixed in with there, was relationships. It's relationships. And so I think, look at the therapeutic outcomes for talk therapy. What's the biggest predictor of successful outcomes? It's the therapeutic alliance. So it's relationships. So just thinking about that's how we can work together more is based on relationships, that we're all connected and that there's more commonalities than differences, I think. So those two.
Brilliant. Thank you.
All right. Try and keep it down to 3. No tokenism.
No.
Number 1, I'd have to say.
Yep.
Don't, you want your project or your organization to be culturally aware and safe, and not really say competent, because nobody can ever be fully competent in any culture unless you are part of it, and even then. Yeah, so I won't even use cultural competency. But yeah, no tokenism. Don't just go and hire somebody, have them come in and say, oh, what do you think about our project? And that they're like, oh, it sounds good. Okay, cool, we're culturally inclusive. Yep. No, get rid of that. That's no good. Second, so many things. Yes. Again, don't bring them in after. Yep. Don't create a project to which you, or an organization or anything like that, to which you are going to be servicing Indigenous people, or you want to include Indigenous people. Bring them in when you start. Don't bring them in after and then say, how do we make this culturally aware afterwards? Do it from the beginning. Save you a lot of time and heartache after, too. Third, I don't know. I think everybody else has said it. Be there. Be in the community. Talk to the people. That's basically your best way.
Yeah, no. Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah. Well, thanks to all 3 of you for that amazing discussion and conversation. I feel Gayagariwi is straight through this in terms of sharing and talking on country. And that whole idea of sharing has bled through all of what we've said in terms of understanding Aboriginal culture. And it just comes down to that simple component of sitting down and having a yarn, sharing and talking, community consultation, understanding, and really integrating in terms of Aboriginal First Nations culture is the world's culture. It exists within our dreaming, within our stories. We all coexist together to provide what we've been talking about, the sharing of how we can provide a better future for our young peoples. And it comes down to that breaking down of those walls and those silos and just simple human sharing. So thank you all.